Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the broadcast this evening. Good evening, sir.
Good evening, Mr. Moderator. Happy to see you and our fellow participants in this program alive in this world of wars and tribulations.
Yes, absolutely. It's been, and it continues to be challenging times across many nations, Iran and even in Africa as well. Sir, let me go right into the questions this evening, because last week there was a particular question that I wanted to put to you, which we said we will start with this week. And that question had to do with the relationship between Ukraine and Israel. And this is where the president of Ukraine had said he was in shock at the fact that Israel had not provided weapons to them. And I wanted to hear your take, and I'm sure our viewers also want to hear your take on that particular point, sir. Is Ukraine justified to have held that position about Israel?
No, Ukraine is not justified. Ukraine has to realize that there are Jews living in Russia. And this is a time when Putin is calling on all citizens of Russia for maximum loyalty, maximum commitment, maximum devotion. And whatever Israel does or does not do is likely to have a repercussion on in fact, likely to pose existential threat to the Jews in Russia. And in fact, since that issue came up last week, there has now been a further development where Russia has threatened to impose a ban on a Jewish NGO that operates in Israel, in Russia, and facilitates facilitates transmission from the diaspora, the Jewish diaspora in Russia, the facilitation of materials to Israel. And now Israel has had to threaten Russia that if Russia does that, then the neutrality of Israel in the Russian-Ukrainian war will be off the table. So Ukraine has to accept the fact that there are multiple interests. I know that Ukraine is fighting for its own life, for its own existence, but then so are other groups in other parts of the world. So for Israel, it has to walk a delicate balance. The Palestinians are allies of Russia. If Israel crosses a particular red line, then Russia could make weapons available to the Palestinians in the West Bank, in Gaza, and also make weapons available to people in Syria who are also at war with Israel. So you've got to look at the interests there. And of course, Russia also has to take into cognizance the fact that Israel could open up another front in Syria that Russia will have to cope with. So both Russia and Israel are walking tight ropes, and Ukraine has to understand that she also has to walk a tightrope. She simply cannot ask for full and total commitment from Israel, ignoring the fact that there are other interests that are at play here.
Thank you for that, sir. But one question before we move away from that point. If Israel were to go all out to back Ukraine, how difficult is that going to make the Russian position in the war?
How difficult? I'm sorry, I didn't get that question.
I said, how difficult is the war going to become for Russia if Israel were to fully take sides with Ukraine?
Oh, it will make things more difficult for Russia. But it may also increase the pressure on Russia to, up its attacks on Ukraine. Because if you notice, the more the United States ups the supply of weapons and the kind of weapons to Ukraine, the more devastating are the kinds of missiles that Russia fires at Ukraine, especially at civilian centers, and not just at troop concentration. And again, don't forget, Putin has gone on record publicly saying, I have tactical nuclear weapons I can use, and I am not bluffing. So to that extent, if Israel were to supply maybe domes, the kind of domes that is used to hold back Palestinian rockets, if it were to supply them to Ukraine, Russia would simply switch to another type of rockets that can either go under the dome or go above the dome. But there's no doubt that it will simply increase what we have seen, the danger of the escalation between Russia and Ukraine.
Thank you, sir. I will put some questions about Russia forward before we leave this point, sir, since we've started with this from last week. One of the developments we've seen, sir, is Putin now making amendments to his initial mobilization and now starting to qualify certain elements of that initial mobilization order. And that has continued since last week. Are we starting to see a pushing back that is being successful from the Ukrainians, and Putin being increasingly pushed into a corner where he's now publicly changing orders that he had made?
Games are being played, and Russia has to it's a clever game on the part of Putin. He has seen the pushback by some people at the war, the cost of the war in Ukraine. He made the second move by issuing the decree for mobilization. He has seen what the Russian people, not just the young, even some of the older people who are parents, he has seen their pushback against the mobilization. He's now got to look for ways in which he could temper the effect of the mobilization within Russia itself. So you are going to be seeing on the part of Russia gradations of his own pushbacks at the successes of the Ukrainian troops in reclaiming even part of the territory that he has now called Russian territories. Is he clever about the way he would do it? It's not just going to jump from rocket fire to tactical nuclear weapons. No, because once you've used tactical nuclear weapons and you forced the Americans to also resort to tactical nuclear weapons, what else are you going to do? Going for global nuclear weapons? No, it's got to be gradation and always allow him to pull back without a loss of face. You will notice that he didn't say that the initial decree that he issued was wrong. He blamed the Ministry of Defense for their interpretation, and that the amendments that he's just made are simply to clarify matters, which is usually the way executive governments, behave. They blame others who have the dirty job of carrying out, instructions given to them, even when those instructions are in writing. It's a clever game, but we are a long way from Putin admitting that he was wrong in going into Ukraine and ordering his troops to withdraw totally from Ukraine. We're a long way from that. Don't hold your breath.
There's a question on that point, sir, that I'd like to raise, because we've seen the gains of Ukraine continue week after week now for almost 3 weeks or 4 weeks or thereabout. And a lot of the territory that had been taken before, Ukrainians are going back in, they're putting their flags in. And at what point do you expect Putin to retaliate with something more drastic, given you are losing ground very severely, given the fact that you've carried out a referendum? People have said, yes, you've won the referendum. And despite that, he's still continuing with the annexation orders. Where do you see him retaliating, sir?
But he is already retaliating. He is already bombing civilian centers. To the nuclear reactors, which in fact he claims now are no longer Ukrainian, that since they are within the territory of annexation, that they now belong to Russia. He's also been upping the ante. My own interpretation of that is he's increasing the claims that is making now, so that when they need to negotiate, he will now be giving up these places that he has no business taking on in the first place. You see, negotiation is involves psychological elements where people are now going to start to say to Ukraine, look, Putin is giving this up, Putin is giving that up, and yet you remain fixed in your position that everything you want, you must get. Are you not being inflexible? They will have forgotten that Putin had no business being in these places in the first place. It's strategic. It's not even tactical anymore. These are strategic moves that Putin is making, and my own interpretation is that he's looking forward to the days when he will have to negotiate.
Thank you, sir. Let's come to Africa, sir, and start in Burkina Faso, where there has been another coup in the space of a year. And we talked about this at the time and what that meant, not just for them, but some of the governing bodies like African Union, OAU, and that. What is your take on the situation in Burkina Faso, sir?
Often, surprises come from unexpected quarters. I would never have suspected that the anti-neocolonialism struggle will actually start from former French territories. One expected that this would start from the English-speaking territories, whose relationship with Britain had gradually been a loosened one. I wasn't expecting that this pushback in Africa will actually start from French-speaking countries where the needs of the former colonial authorities are right on the necks of those territories. These are territories where what we call the colonial pact is still very, very entrenched. And we have discussed the colonial pact on this program. So let me move on and not go into the details of the colonial pact. What seems to be happening in Burkina Faso, and it has happened in Mali, and it has happened in the Central African Republic, is that young forces, what I will call the Thomas Sankara forces within the armed forces in these areas, have seen through the shenanigans of France that they are not gaining anything from French military presence in their countries. And that on the other hand, it's like the French are simply there to pursue their own interests. And therefore, that they want the French out. To that extent, the latest coup in Burkina Faso is not only against the Burkinabe officer corps, but it's also against the French forces that are still based in Burkina Faso, and that they think are the ones dictating what the government should do or not do. And to that extent, it's rather strange that they were waving Russian flags, that they don't want Russia. I mean, they don't want France. They don't want ECOWAS. They don't want African Union they want Russia to come and help them put their houses in order. The Russians are also in Mali, and the Russians are also in the Central African Republic. Yes, they are not there as official Russian forces, because we are playing a game of propaganda. They are called Russian mercenaries in order to denigrate the Russian involvement there. Why don't you call the these forces from Nepal, who are part of the British military forces, why don't you call them mercenaries? The Gurkhas. Why don't you call them mercenaries? They're not British. Britain pays the government of Nepal to recruit these people for some years to fight within British forces. You don't call them mercenaries, but if it's others, you will call them mercenaries. So, to that extent, what we are seeing in the Sahel is a reaction against the overbearing presence of French forces, which are of no benefit to those countries. And so it looks to me like the second wave of African freedom is actually coming from the French-speaking forces rather than the English-speaking forces.
So when we look at this situation, in less than a year, there have been 2 coups. When the previous President Damiba came on, there were promises, we're going to improve security, we're going to make things better in the country. And yet, in less than 12 months, even his own army, his own team, if we could use that word, are then saying, sorry, it's not working, and they've carried out this coup. My question, sir, is this showing a difficulty in governing African nations that maybe we don't see in other nations?
That would not be my interpretation. People listening to me may actually accuse me of perhaps being overcommitted to the conspiracy theory. I don't believe that African military forces are actually independent of influence and dictates of foreign forces, where they were trained, where they have built up relationships. And so to that extent, I don't think in any African country we deal with an army with a unified purpose, a unified vision, and a united esprit de corps. But to that extent, whenever you have a coup, it's not the totality of the army that carries that out, it's a section of the army. And probably from day one, another section starts planning how to overthrow that military regime. So it's not that. Why should Africa be? Africa is not the only continent with multinational nationalities. In fact, Asia has it, Latin America has it. I think the stability of each African country is a function of the level of interference that it gets from Europe and the United States. Again, I've said it on this program. How many years ago was Gaddafi killed? How many years? And 2 weeks ago, we finally got the new Prime Minister of Italy actually accusing France of being the force against the invasion of Libya and the assassination of Gaddafi. Of course, we all know it was not just France. Britain was involved, and the United States under Obama was involved. So we've never been left alone. I know there are some people who have said, after 60 years of independence, Prof, give up on this conspiracy theory. But Gaddafi was not killed 60 years ago, was he? Sankara was not killed 60 years ago, was he? And the series of coups we've had in Chad, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, were those 60 years ago? These are all with living memory, 2 years, 3 years.
Yes, sir. Let us look at some news about South Africa, sir. 2 key points. One is the report that came out of, or the announcement, I should say, that came out of Buckingham Palace, that South African President Ramaphosa was going to be the first leader of a nation to be on a state visit to Buckingham Palace to have an audience with King Charles III. How significant is that for Africa?
It is very significant for Africa. It is significant for the Commonwealth. It's going to take me quite a long while to tease out the significance of this invitation. But let me say this. There was an interview granted by Nelson Mandela when he was, no, after, I think after he was president, he was in retirement. And he was expressing his disappointment with Nigeria. And he said, the black race, he didn't say Nigerians, he didn't say Africans. He said, the black race will not get off from its knees until Nigeria sorts itself out and provides the leadership that it's supposed to provide for the black race in the world. Now, this is a former president of South Africa saying this. He didn't say his own country, South Africa, has all it takes to lead the black race. He said Nigeria. Surely he must know why he didn't pick on South Africa, his own country, to be the leader of the black race. So to that extent, there is no doubt that the invitation to South Africa, coupled, by the way, with South Africa membership in BRICS, South Africa being invited to summits of G20, etc., an indication that the global north, especially the global Western north, is determined to build up South Africa as the representative of Africa the representative of the Black race for reasons which we all know. I think it is more a failure of Nigerian leadership, a failure of Nigerian foreign policy that is being exploited. I don't want to say more than this so as not to sound offensive, because again, if we go back and read and re-listen to what President Zuma has said, what he has said about different South African presidents, who made them, how each South African president has become a multi-millionaire from having nothing on the eve of independence, now to becoming multi-millionaires. I don't want to use my words. I will say, go back and listen to President Zuma, what he has to say. Then it will become understandable why the global Western North will seek to build up South Africa as the representative of Africa. And they will succeed if other countries in Africa don't put their house in order and stop behaving as if the world is just there waiting for them. Don't be surprised if South Africa becomes the favorite candidate for the permanent seat in the Security Council of the UN, representing this part of Africa. Don't be surprised. But the fault will be ours. We can see the game they're playing. Whether they succeed or not will now depend on whether countries, you know the countries. I don't again need to mention names of countries. You know the countries who can get their acts together and seem to be behaving like spoiled children, get their oil stolen instead of making a bumper harvest from what is happening. They are complaining that 500,000. In fact, the announcement yesterday was that they finally found a pipe which had been used to steal oil from Nigeria. That pipe had been going from one of the fields into the middle of the sea and into waiting tankers. 9 years, and they've just found out. But when you put people who shouldn't be, when you put square pegs in round holes, this is what you get.
While we're still talking about South Africa, sir, there is an interesting point relating to the war between the war going on in Ethiopia between the government and the Tigray people. And that is the fact that the African Union has also chosen South Africa as the destination to potentially mediate that conflict that's going on there. And of course, one of the things they did, they picked 3 key people: former president of Nigeria, former president of Kenya, and the former deputy president of South Africa to be the envoy of the African Union that will be mediating that particular conflict. What is your reaction to that, sir? Why, again, South Africa and the choice of people who are part of that envoy? Can they really bring change to the situation?
Well, I would say, let us pray for the success of that mission. Ethiopia is a very significant nation within the African continent. One, if not the only African nation that fought and defeated a Western power and resisted, being colonized. One remembers the role of the emperor in even the formation of the Organization of African Unity, which is now African Union. He was one of the bridge builders. One remembers the role of the emperor during the Nigerian Civil War. I will support anything that brings that civil war in Ethiopia to an end, because the war had external supporters, and the more Ethiopia is bled, the more Africa is weakened. So while I have no explanation for why South Africa will be the seat for the mediation, I can understand why they will pick the three people they have picked. At least I can understand why they've picked two of them. The third one, I don't understand, but that doesn't really matter. The important thing is for the government of Ethiopia and the secessionist movement in Tigray to reach agreement within the unified parameters of Ethiopia itself, so that Ethiopia can get back to joining the progressive forces in Africa for the salvation of Africa. I wish them luck.
Thank you for that, sir. Let's go to North Korea, South Korea axis, and talk about the recent visit of US Vice President Kamala Harris to the area. And of course, hours after she departed, North Korea fired some missiles, and South Korea responded with the US. One key point, sir, that I'd like to get your comment on is the fact that one of the missiles from North Korea went over Japan. How significant is that, and how should Japan be responding to that situation?
Well, and the elementary answer is that the significance of it shows the capability of North Korea. And the fact that he did it is a message to not only the United States, but to the countries in that area that are allies of the United States, that now you have to start asking yourself the question, would America go to war over our differences with you? You know, that used to be, and I think I've said it on this program before, when I was a postgraduate student at the Fletcher School, that used to be the question. You know, if the Soviet Union attacked Rome or attacked Milan, not Rome, attacked Milan, would the United States attack St. Petersburg, which was Leningrad at that time, knowing that Soviet Union would then attack New York? In other words, do you risk New York in order to prevent an attack on Milan? And usually the answer is no, that everybody knows that, but that it will never get to that stage. And what the North Korean have done is to show that if we want to hit Japan, now we have the capability to do so. And you, the Japanese, must now start to ask yourself whether the United States will risk a war, going to war, in order to save you. Of course, it's a very short-sighted calculation on the part of North Korea, because you see, since the end of the Second World War, Japan's constitution had imposed a Pacific profile on Japan, on its foreign policy, on its military policy, on even its military institution, that the Japanese forces were restricted to peacekeeping operations, under the flag of the United Nations. But in the past 10 years, there has been a movement within Japan to actually restructure this post-Second World War profile and have Japan adopt, they have Japan accept that there are existential threats to Japan, and to that extent, it should amend its constitution and allow for formation of armed forces which will have sufficient capability to project the interests of Japan. What this flying of a missile will have done will be two things. It will increase the strength of the domestic forces wanting to restructure the constitution of Japan. But more importantly, it probably will strengthen the United States support for this movement, because it's the United States that have been the guarantor of the independence of Japan and the survival of Japan. Now, the United States has actually, since the time of, even before Trump, had been complaining that they cannot bear the burden of defending, whether it's in NATO or now in the South Pacific, they cannot bear the burden alone, that they're expecting people in that area, countries in that area, to chip in and increase their own load shed. This will now strengthen those who will be seen in the US. Let us support the restructuring in Japan. Let us support the beefing up. Let the Japanese pay for their own armed forces and develop whatever it is that needs to be developed. Thirdly, even though this has happened over Japan, the message is not going to be lost on South Korea, because whatever can happen to Japan can happen to South Korea. And we have now in power a government in South Korea that actually is quite militaristic and believes that appeasement of the North has not worked in the past, is not going to work, and that therefore South Korea should be allowed actually to beef up its own forces. And so I can foresee that a consequence of this of this latest exercise by North Korea is building a nodal of power in the South Pacific that will be not independent, but that will add value to American presence there. So in containing North Korea. So we are really again now, in addition to the war going on in Europe, we've just heated up what is going to happen in the South Pacific. And we are not talking about the Chinese-Taiwan war. The world is becoming, I'm afraid, a very unsafe place for everybody.
So let us talk about open. Got about 10 minutes left. The group has defied the United States, and they've gone ahead with the cuts to oil production, and United States did all they could to try to stop that. How would you respond to that? Is OPEC starting to gain that more independent decision-making and pushing back the influence of the United States on their activity? And what does that mean for the world at large?
Well, it's unfortunate that a country that thought how to, influence people and make friends, somehow has become a country that knows how to make enemies and revels in making enemies. When you will recall, again, it's on this program, when Biden became president and said that the arrowhead of his foreign policy was going to be strengthening democracies in the world. First of all, the people advising Biden seem to have forgotten that some of the countries that the United States regard as allies, like Saudi Arabia, are not democratic. And one could count a few other countries that the United States regarded as allies. Number two, that when you decide that you are going to build up your foreign policy group on democratic countries, you've forgotten that you need the support of countries like China and Russia in order to ameliorate conditions in the world. And you need them as partners in conflict management and what have you. Most of those members of OPEC are not democracies. but you declare them antagonists ab initio. And then when you needed them, you now think they're going to forget that you have targeted them as antagonists. It showed the short-sightedness that one didn't expect of a country like the United States, with all these think tanks that they have all over their nation. And a lot of the pushbacks that the United States is getting is actually payoff for the antagonistic policies of the United States towards these countries. Yes, finally, Biden flew to Saudi Arabia. The crown prince that you have said you will never talk to, you'll never shake hands with, because of what he did, he had to be the one you are now appealing to help save the economy of the Western world arising out of the Ukrainian, and of course, he's had to think of the interests of Saudi Arabia, and each of the different members in OPEC had to think of their own interests and not the interests of the United States. I recall one of the foreign ministers in the global south saying to the Secretary of State of the United States, the Ukrainian war is your war, it's not our war. When was the last time you identified with anything that was of major interest to us, that you are now saying we should drop everything and identify with with what is of interest to you? That is also what you are. I'm stretching my answer to show that it is not just OPEC. Even look at the islands, the South Pacific Islands, Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, etc., etc. They said, if you continue, if this climate change continues, they will be drowned. And they have been screaming about that. The United States haven't paid any attention to them, neither Australia. But the moment China turns up to say, we will assist you in working against forces of climatic change, the United States is now busy summoning all of them to the White House to come and sign agreements. And the Prime Minister of Solomon Islands said, why should I sign the agreement? The agreement focuses on your own concern with China, not on the existentialist concern of Solomon Islands. So what has happened now is that in launching the attacks which America has launched on the OPEC countries, you again have made enemies of this very powerful economic organization. They say that they need to cut oil production because they cannot afford to have prices falling, because they need money to sustain their economy. Some of the problems they have arising from even the Russian Ukrainian war, they need more resources to cope with that. They have to, they are facing food problem, prices of I mean, since both Ukraine and Russia are no longer in a position to sell wheat, grain into the market, that they need more resources to pay for the scarcity of the goods that has led to prices going up. And you are saying they are siding with Russia. So, you know, the war in Ukraine is leading to the demise of the old world order, and is starting to manifest itself in the beginning of a new world order. And each organization is scrambling. Each continent is scrambling to ensure that in the new world order, its interests are made manifest. Not that somebody speaks on their behalf, but that they will be there. Only yesterday, one organization, a new organization, was formed called European Political Summit. And to show you the implication and the relationship of this new organization with a new world order. Of course, Russia was not invited, but Israel was invited to be a member. The United States, which had been the linchpin of the global West security arrangement, was not invited to the meeting. So in other words, the Europeans, and this was something midwifed by Macron. And you know from day one, Macron's agenda in Europe has been diminish American interests, promote a new European security package, presumably under French leadership. Whether it will succeed or not, it's a totally different issue here. But the fact is, it has been made manifest. The 44 countries showed up in Prague yesterday for the summit meeting. So to that extent, we are seeing the consequences, all right? Some of them foreseen, some of them unforeseen, of the Russian-Ukrainian war, and the extent to which it will manifest in a new world order. But that there will be a going back to the old order, that it was dependent on the use of the dollar for global trade, no. I'm not saying it will be the use of yuan or the use of ruble, no. Probably each, again, you know, each region will pitch in with its own demand. Don't forget that one of the things that Gaddafi was, you know, pushing was an African currency. Maybe it will have been called the euro, that will be part of what will be used as currency for global trade when he was killed. One of the reasons, again, that he was killed was because the Americans see any attempt at any new currency for global trade as a threat to the dollar. Of course, by that time, they were not saying that Russia will actually invade Ukraine, and the emergence of all these new currencies will actually become inescapable. I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now, sir?
Now I can hear you.
Oh, okay. Sorry, sir. There was one question. I know we've run out of time, but I want to put this question to you. It's a direct question here. And this person is saying that the Swedish police has just announced that there is evidence to suggest that there were detonations on the Nord Stream 1 and 2 gas pipelines. And the person wants to know if the West was to be found culpable in that issue there, how will that change the war?
Look, that there were detonations is not the issue. We know there were detonations. Who did it? Who blew up those pipelines? That is the critical issue. And I think I dealt with this matter last week. There are the following suspects. It could have been done by the Russians themselves, as what they call, a black operation, so that they can blame somebody else, and that will justify their own special forces now going to, blow up or interfere with gas or oil pipelines in Europe or even in the United States. Two, it could be forces within Russia itself who are anti-Putin. Some of them are in the armed forces. Three, it could have been done by the special forces of Ukraine. Fourth, it could have been done. In fact, one needs to be careful about the sources of some of this information. But 3 days ago, on the social media, there was something that a whistleblower within the Pentagon has said that the United States knew all about it. It wasn't quite specific that the United States did it, but that the United States knew all about it. So we don't know who did it. And those who know are not saying, are not talking. But the lesson about this is we are moving into dangerous waters. Pardon the pun. Because the moment things like this start to happen and you have deniability, I didn't do it, I don't know who did it, then you could even have other forces that have, who just want to create problems, who want to create trouble. They could be the ones, and you wouldn't know. So to that extent, the earlier, if I would have loved to draw attention to the fact that finally the Holy Father last Sunday decided to move away from a position of neutrality and really start to become involved by suggesting parameters, by suggesting that both parties should move into area of negotiation, ceasefire. And what the Holy Father then needs to do is to build up the parameters for resolving this matter. And the parameters are already there. Kissinger came up several months ago. I had indicated about 6 months ago what I thought should be acceptable to both parties. And the Holy Father getting involved addresses the issue of saving face. Putin can really agree to the Pope's position and not lose face. Because, as I said last week, the Pope has no troops. Therefore, you cannot say Russia was defeated by the Vatican troops. No. So to that extent, that has been a good movement from last week.
Thank you very much, sir. And sorry for taking you over time slightly there on that point. Thank you to our viewers. We'll be back same time next week. Good night, sir.
Good night. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Good night, sir.